today is going to be about moving the needle of anthropocentricity. Now, if anyone is wondering what the hell that means, it basically means human-centered morals. So anthro, human, po-centricity, human-centered, and then morals in this instance. And we're going to be talking about that in the context of animal rights, and we're going to go through a few key sort of parts of the agenda. So buckle up, there's quite a lot to get through. As usual, I've tried to cram in a lot of stuff into half an hour. However, first off, we're going to do a little bit of background and research about who I am and what I do as a sort of, an instance as a founder director for an animal rights company. Moving into my area of research, which is about expanding our moral circle and understanding what other creatures in the world owe us and what we owe them in terms of like moral responsibility and stuff. And then we're going to do a quick overview of my area of study, which is critical animal studies, moving into a really cool thing called multidimensional liberation theory. And I won't be saying that too often, that's going to be condensed to MLT. And then the landscape of animal rights activism and the future of animal rights activism and how I see it going. And then sort of a call to action, really. So to kick off, I am Stuart Evans, as you heard, from the Animal Alliance Project. Prior to the Animal Alliance Project, I started the Environmental Alliance Project back in July of 2021, which spoke more to like eco-activism and sustainability and that sort of movement, and sort of connecting and advocacy, networking, directory, that sort of stuff. And it was really, really good. Did a TED talk last year around the environment and nature and our moral consideration towards trees. You should go watch it, it's quite interesting. And I'm also a member of the European Association for Critical Animal Studies to do with my research. But to get started, the landscape of animal rights. So most of you will be familiar with animal rights, which is a wonderful thing. The question I often get asked from a lot of people who are trying to get involved in different movements is, how can I get involved? I say, well, how would you like to get involved? If anyone was at Matt Glover's talk on day one, you would have heard him say, well, if you've got skill sets, use them. And I think that's a really, really valuable point to take away. If you have a skill set and you think it can be useful to the movement, do it. However, I've made a tree. Now, there's a lot of information on here, and I did get carried away, but for the purposes of today, sort of three main areas that I think are important to cover and I think are mimicked across the movement. So at the base of this tree, we have consumer activism. Now, as a consumer activist, that can be any number of things. And most of us would have started our journey by, in veganism and going plant-based, is sort of boycotting certain foods and certain brands because they don't align with our own moral ethics now after becoming vegan or plant-based. So we would buy vegan products. We will have an increased social awareness of the impacts of our consumerism and what we purchase and what we consume. And we will also probably be lobbying to our friends and family, hey, have you heard of this thing that I am now doing, which is veganism or animal rights or going plant-based? That will obviously increase social awareness, and it will increase the people around you and understanding what you're doing on a day-to-day basis and why on earth all you do is eat grass every day, which is fair enough. My favorite way of consumer activism, though, is a vegan potluck. Now, if anyone has done one of these, it's a wonderful thing. You just go around to a friend's house and say, hey, here's a vegan chili con carne, you're going to really love it. And they go, I thought it tasted different. For some reason, everyone can taste the difference in vegan food, which is bizarre. However, that's a really, really easy way of getting involved in the animal rights movement. It's a fantastic sort of plenary of, well, I'm now thinking about animals more concertedly. What can I do? Well, I'm going to change my eating habits. That's just a really easy way of going in. Moving up the tree. Grassroots activism, one of the most interesting areas in both eco-activism and animal activism, is seeing the outcrops of more like direct action and social movements that don't really have like a formal form of organization. Now, you can see the likes of Greenpeace or the Humane League and bigger organizations that have taken more of a charitable instance on. Likely they would have been started in a grassroots initiative. And we see that in like Animal Rising, we see that in Extinction Rebellion. These are fantastic ways in getting involved in more of a sort of visceral way of understanding the movement. So you might be going and doing direct action, you might be doing protests, you might be doing all sorts of other things with your time that help better and further the cause of animal rights. So you can look at that and do protests, obviously, a really, really great way of raising awareness to the public. You might get a bit of backlash from it, you might indeed get arrested, unfortunately. But moving in a sort of a less aggravated way, volunteering for like animal charities or sanctuaries. These are also good ways of exposing yourself to the ways that we love and care for animals in a different way to going out and seeing them being exploited in certain conditions like factory farming and doing vigils and stuff. Animal saves, again, when we look at the great work done by some of the activism groups upstairs in the exhibition centre, we see, well, hey, we're actually got a real big issue out there. Like, what are we fighting? What are we facing? Here are the problems that we're doing. Now, Animal slaves are inherently dangerous in what they are, both politically, ideologically, and physically. You're putting your body out there in a way that you probably wouldn't in any other situation, but it's a way of getting involved, and it's a way that we do need to help keep on exposing the cruelty that animals are exposed to on a daily basis. And obviously social media campaigns. Now, I came across my veganism journey mostly through social media campaigns, through like Vegan for the Animals or Sentient Media. You can think about these platforms as a great way of just getting like a daily newsletter of what's going on in the world. And I think that's a wonderful way of getting involved also, because it keeps you aware of what you're doing every day. You're volunteering in some ways to say, yeah, I'm part of a good thing, because look at all the work that people are doing around me, and look how I can spread that to potentially non-vegans who might become vegans or plant-based advocates because of the work that I'm doing. That isn't necessarily direct action, isn't necessarily volunteering, but it gets you in a space of betterment in that sense. Moving further up the tree, though, the longer-term efforts, and this is where I don't want to say it's boring, because it does take a lot of time to get things pushed through, which do improve the lives of animals a lot more than potentially consumer activism might. But it is a really, really needed space. And we can see that in the idea of like political lobbying or corporate engagements, or pushing towards legal advocacy in animal liberation and like anti-ag-gag lawsuits that suppress the voices of animal activists trying to expose the exploitation these animals go through. Okay, this is a really, really important space where the movement can really start to have longer-term impacts on animal exploitation throughout the world, because as all of this movement sort of starts to come together, it'll force people in society to confront their own cognitive dissonance and say, well, why are these guys shouting about animal rights? I like my dog. Okay, but let's think about that a few steps forward. Why are we shouting about cows being exploited? Why are we shouting about chickens being exploited? There's a reason. And they'll go, well, what's the reason then? Now, you can watch the direct save videos. You can go on and see the footage of the animals being exploited directly in their conditions. You could also go to these places and see these things happening to them. Or, as many do, will go, I don't want to see that. Why is it I don't want to see that? And then confront their own moral issues just inwardly. I'm quite a resilient person, I feel. I've seen some horrific footage, but that's not everyone. That's not everyone. Even I was pretty shaken by it, and I don't watch that sort of footage anymore, unless I have to for certain research reasons, because I've already been converted. I know what I'm stopping. But it is good to have that footage there to say to people, look, if you are genuinely despondent to the research, to the scientific consensus that this is killing the planet, why don't you see what you're paying for? Try it. If they're not swayed, then you're not going to change them, and I wouldn't worry about it. But that's a really, really good place to be in a long-term effort, is getting the understanding that this is a long battle. It has been a long battle, and we're making strides every single time we do it. However, the next part is expanding moral frameworks, which is my area of research, okay? So in expanding moral framework, imagine the world to be sort of a still lake for a second, and our actions in the world are like the rock we drop into this very still lake. The ripples they make are the people and non-human animals and nature that it impacts. And I consider it sort of like the stone is essentially the action that you take towards yourself. You've got to be the center of consideration, whatever you do. You've got to look after yourself first, otherwise you might not be able to look after other people. When we're out doing protests or when we're considering animals, there are reasons for doing this. There are reasons for considering an expanded moral framework. So where we start off, anthropocentrism. Right, so anthropocentrism are human-centered morals, and this is where majority of the world live, okay? So when we're thinking about our daily actions, when we're going about our daily business, the general consensus is humans have rights, they are inalienable, they are something that we all possess inherently, and we should always, always, always uphold those values. So you won't see people in the street, hopefully, going out and just randomly punching someone in the face. That's a kind of consensus, and I like that consensus, it's a good consensus. We treat humans fairly and equally like we'd like to be treated, the golden rule, all that sort of stuff. So, who is morally considerable in anthropocentrism? Human beings. Nice and simple. Human beings with an asterisk, because obviously we don't sort of see that fallout in many places. We see it in society, general day-to-day, but there is still human trafficking, there is still human exploitation, slavery, all sorts of things. So not all humans, but most. And I think most people who are good and willing in the world will want to have a human-to-human relationship which is positive, kind, compassionate, loving, etc. Well, how do we how do we get these people involved? How do we get everything else that isn't morally considerable involved? Well, this is where a lot of the global north sit. It's something to do with a sentientist attitude. Okay, so sentient-centered morals. Who do we know that has sentience? Well, other sentient beings, mammals primarily, dogs, cats, rabbits, guinea pigs, horses, not cows. This is where veganism starts to butt up against quite a few issues. Is because when you start to say, well, we should consider other sentient beings, okay, that's fine, but I like eating some of those sentient beings. Why should I change? Okay, well, that's going to be difficult to explain. So the vegan movement, unfortunately, and you see a lot of exposés not even trying to tackle fish, not even trying to tackle reptiles or insects, because that feels like a wasted argument. And the majority of people who see cats and dogs as inherently different from pigs and cows, whereas their visceral lived phenomenological experience is inherently different to that of us or our companion animals, okay? So that's where sentientism is. If we move further out and actually say, well, okay, we're in a climate crisis. We're in a climate crisis and we got to save the Earth systems. How do we get further than that? We move to biocentrism, which means organism-centered. Now, this is where I like to live from a climatological perspective. I like to see it from the idea that if we are going to try and save animals, there is no point, I say there's no point, from a research and a moral perspective, there's no point sort of drawing a line at a sentience-based thing, because we only know that these animals have sentience through research, technically through research, and an understanding that they share certain biological relationality to us, that they can see, they can hear, they can think, they can feel in certain ways. Now, I think that's almost a little bit loaded insofar as we know that mammals might think the same of us, but we have no real understanding or way of understanding how a chameleon thinks. Like, I haven't got a tongue that long, not a chance. And I will never know the world through a chameleon's eyes. But I kind of want to give it the time of day and say, well, okay, they probably won't know what I think and feel, but there's probably a shared relationality there. And I think anyone who actually comes face to face with any animal, if you give it enough time, there's a sort of camaraderie there. There's an understanding that you are both creatures on this earth. And there's no real reason why you should sort of draw the line and say, oh, I'm going to treat my dog really nicely, but yeah, unfortunately, I'm going to step on you. It just feels a bit strange. I'm not saying that there should be equal and completely holistic rights for all animals on this earth, because if you trod on a worm and went to jail, it feels a little bit, I don't know, that feels a bit wrong. But biocentrism in of itself tries to push that moral framework outwards to say, not just sentient creatures, but all creatures. So who's morally considerable? The bubble's getting bigger, the ripples are getting further, okay? The ripples are moving outward. But the morally inconsiderable, unfortunately, still remains plant-based life and ecosystem, okay? So we move to ecocentrism. We can see the bubble getting further out. This is the last one, don't worry. Right, so ecosystem-centered. Now, if we have a trouble treating cows okay, can you imagine the uproar if we treated trees okay? Now, this is what kind of my TED Talk revolved around last year, was basically thinking, well, when we think of a tree, what comes to mind? Okay, and that was the sort of the catchphrase for it. And you might think, the tree in of itself, the leaves, the branches, the sticks, and all that good stuff. You might also think the wildlife that inhabits that tree, the worms, the birds, the squirrels, whatever. But you don't necessarily then relate it to a table or a guitar or a piano. But those things are both, all these things are made out of wood. So when you're giving tree rights, and when you're giving ecosystems rights, and when you're thinking more morally about these things, you come into a lot of trouble. Because how can human development continue to develop if we can't exploit the things that are in the natural world around us? Where we're standing, everything around here, go back, good few hundred years, was likely just forest. Most of England going back 1,000 years ago was forest. And now it's not. It's mainly flat land, arable land for farming. Not in a good way, but for farming. So, yeah, ecocentrism is a wonderful ripple that brings everything outwards. But I think it's a bit of an anomaly to think about it from a community perspective, to start here and move out here. We almost need to think backwards. We need to think, well, how do we start at ecosystems and move our way back to humans from a community perspective? Like, as an individual, you must always put yourself first, because that is the most important thing. You are the most important person to you. But as a community, as a legal system, if we started with ecosystems and worked our way in, it'd be a lot more consistent than if we started with humans and worked our way out. And this is where the sort of commonality of oppression starts to show its roots in like how we treat animals is directly how we treat nature and how we treat humans. And that's the sort of the next part of this talk. So my field of research is in critical animal studies, okay? I'm a part of the European Association for Critical Animal Studies, but how I got into it was through the Institute for Critical Animal Studies. And this has been going since about 2008, 2010, a little bit longer in different formats. But why do we need it in the animal liberation movement from a research perspective? Some of the themes that I've been looking at in CAS, Critical Animal Studies or CAS, are about divisions of power, about character-based discrimination, and especially like historic and embedded power structures, and the real issues that we face in the climate crisis and the Anthropocene, okay? And that is essentially industrialism, capitalism, and globalization. Neocolonialism and colonialism especially do play into that, and neoliberalism. All these things start to influence how modern society sees and views animals and nature. And it's a really, really problematic lens to view the world through, where the individual, the I, the ego, has this ability to enforce its will on the world in any way it wants, because they can buy the brand new phone and think nothing of the supply chain, think nothing of the environment that's destroyed, the people that it's affected, or because, hey, yeah, one of my phone suppliers says I can get a discount on my new phone. Fantastic. This old one works, but I want the new one. And there's no moral repercussions for that. You can walk into Tesco, pick a steak off a shelf, and have no moral repercussions because it's legal, it is there, supply chain does it, and society backs it up because it's just accepted, which is mad. So CAS, in a sense, has a lot of overlapping themes, okay? So right in the middle here, you can see sort of critical animal studies, but it is informed by lots of other critical theories. So critical feminist theory, critical race theory, eco-activism, critical disability and queer theory. All of these things start to speak to the commonality of oppression that is faced, especially by animals in the world, okay? So when we're looking over this side, we can see the sort of critical frameworks being built by formative texts in critical race and critical feminist theory. We're looking at diversity, equity, inclusivity in the ways that we view the world and the ways that we can actually encompass our understanding of the other, like the other in the world that we see in front of us. You know, we're bringing in First Nation indigenous perspectives that go far back and way more back in time than any Western or industrialized viewpoint would have us believe that the world can actually work. So it's stewardship, it's compassion for the environment, it's about creating a community that goes beyond the human to human interaction that we have. It goes to human to animal, human to nature. We have empathetic activism. We have, UN SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. They have their own issues, but for the time being, we can sort of roll with them. All of these things speak to, again, marginalized voices that all appear in the critical animal studies tradition, okay? So 2 books that really, really influenced my journey as a vegan, especially in my research, are Af and Sil Ko's Black Vegan Sisters, amazing, you should check them out. Their Aphorism, which is a sort of collection of pop culture, feminism, and black veganism, which really kind of like blew my mind as a white guy. I was like, wow, there's a whole other diversity of thought out there, because I study philosophy, and you guess who I learned in philosophy? It's Plato through to Kant, and it's just basically white man after white man after white man after white man. And that really informs a philosophical viewpoint of the world that says, yeah, white men have all the good ideas. Shocker, that's not the case. And I didn't know that for the longest time. I'm up here talking about black vegan work, and I love that because it's such a diversity of views. So the book that really blew my mind, though, is Racism as Zoological Witchcraft by Afko. This is Afko, say hello, Af. And in her book, Racism as Zoological Witchcraft, which, by the way, is a really, really cool title, she talks about multidimensional liberation theory. I love all these words. MLT, we'll call that MLT for the time being. Now, she speaks from the perspective of black oppression and the oppression of animals and the exploitation that both black bodies and animal bodies face. And she talks about it from more of a media studies perspective. I come from more of a philosophical perspective, so I won't be really touching on that. And I'll be abstracting the blackness out of this equation purely because I think it speaks to a wider theme that I have seen apparent in the movement, which is people are engaged in animal oppression, but sometimes miss out on the greater understanding that all oppression is shared oppression. Now, that's not to sort of like delineate from any one idea that says we shouldn't be focusing on feminist works or we shouldn't be focusing on critical race theory. It's about saying, what are we all trying to complain about? And it's usually white, patriarchal, colonial, industrial, capitalist, blah, 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 thoughts that has led us to the viewpoint now where we have such oppression in the world and such systems that prop these things up. that are causing inherent issues in the Anthropocene, the climate crisis, animal agriculture industry, oppression of people, slavery, human trafficking. It has all sort of bombarded ourselves into one horrible, messy, just pile that you go, well, what's a way out of it? So I'm going to read a few quotes now, and this will be taken directly from her book in chapter 3. So, our understanding of the problem has to take a new shape altogether, and Af is here talking about the problem of oppression, essentially, which will inform our movements for liberation. Over time, I have realized that the movements themselves are unfortunately becoming problematic spaces because some activists are resistant to rethinking the solutions they've created. Our activist setup is a product of the oppressive system we are fighting, and that's by no means, and this is me speaking now, that's by no means I guess maybe a conscious bias towards working on any one thing. Greenpeace was set up with really, really good intentions, I'm sure. Many, movements that were set up to combat the patriarchy or racism were set up with good intentions in creating an equitable and just world. So AF frames it in such a way that we see these different oppressions in different houses. So we have, racial oppression, we have sexism, we have sort of classism in these neat little boxes of activism. We can sort of tick and say we've done that. And most of you will probably have heard sort of intersectional theory, where we try to slam these houses together and see what falls out of them. AF goes beyond that. She says we need more than that. We need a multidimensional liberation theory. Okay? If you understand the problem, this is her again, if you understand the problem only through a two-dimensional lens, you will see a two-dimensional solution, which aren't solutions that really get to the root of the problem. In that setup, multiple movements will be invoked, each to tackle one oppression. So, here's what we should be doing. Yes, we should all have our own houses, but, and these are her diagrams, by the way, we should all be going into the master's house, essentially. To coin a phrase, Audre Lorde, the master's house will only be dismantled with the master's tools. We should all be going into this house and dismantling it, which is, unfortunately, the biggest house, which has the most clout. But we should all be going in through different entrances, the way that we see that house. We will see a one-sided view of that kind of oppression. Racism will have a one-dimensional view of how people are oppressed racially. Sexism will have a one-dimensional view of how that is. But that's just all different sides of this house. So we need to understand that we're all collectively working towards a movement which dismantles this oppressive house, okay? So she goes on to say, multi-dimensional activists have multiple entrances into the structure, meaning that they don't necessarily just see the obvious way in, like the front door, for example. They see the multiple social factors and actors are buttressing structural oppression, which is why they may choose to go around the back and the side, climbing through a skylight, etc. Understanding and noticing that such dimensions exist are the first step to bringing down that structure. Okay? This is the really, really sort of important quote from her book. If we don't see the full picture of our oppression, then our activism will be missing crucial parts and perspectives, with direct consequences for how we organize our own liberation. Now, I think that's a really, really key point here, is that many sort of, and why I set up the Environmental Alliance Project and the Animal Alliance Project, is many people don't get why I'm saving the animals or why I'm saving the house. Animal activists will say to me, well, we've got to save the animals and the environment will sort out itself. The environmentalists will say, I can still eat meat, but I want to stop deforestation in the Amazon. And I'm going, guys, we're talking about the same thing here. We should be talking together. You guys should go plant-based and you guys should stop, eating soy from the Amazon, blah, blah, blah. And then we get onto the consequence. I'm not going to get into that. So, right, the future of animal rights. Okay, the last little bit. I think I'm running to time, which is absolutely amazing. The future of animal rights. What I do in my company, Environmental and the Animal Alliance projects, are basically the joined up thinking in the movement. Because I feel like there's a lot of space which doesn't really speak to this whole idea of commonality of oppression. We all have our own epistemological viewpoint or standpoint, which is basically the way that we view the world. We have our own lenses of which we have been given or forced upon us by certain societal, cultural influences, and we all have our own way of looking at animal oppression. Critical animal studies basically just looks at all these different variations and goes, hey, this is a really big mess. How are we going to sort it out? And there's not going to be any one grand unified theory which sorts it out. I think that's the one key problem with most of today's solutions, is that they say, we've got the key to solving climate change. It's carbon, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, okay, but that's not really the answer, is it? We've got to have a diversity of answers. And I think what's happened in the West is that we've gone down this sort of monoculture of ideas where it's going to be one idea that solves everything. And that's just not the case. We are such a diverse planet, we're such diverse people, that we all have our own little geographic pockets of solutions. Because, I mean, down in the southeast, we've got terrible water pollution issues. Okay, that might be ubiquitous across the country, but from where I am, I'm seeing sewage pour out into the sea. I'm not going to be saying, oh, you know what, the sand's a bit muddy today. I'm going to be going, that's a problem, and I'm going to be pointing at the sea. But someone inland might be going, well, I don't have sea, I don't have that issue. I have rivers which need to be taken care of. And someone next to an abattoir might be saying, well, I'm getting pollution from this abattoir, and I'm also hearing the sounds of animals screaming. That's my issue. There are lots of issues in lots of different geographic areas, which speaks to lots of different kinds of oppression. That's not to mention the person-to-person oppression that might be faced through systemic injustice or epistemological injustice or any kind of direct injustice that you might face as a person or a people. So the future of animal rights for me is basically thinking, well, how do we join up these movements? How do we get to a multidimensional liberation which speaks to the equitable liberation of lots of different groups, whether they be from minoritized points of oppression, from points of slavery, from points of sexism, or points of animal oppression? How do we get to that point? And I'll show you one of the first diagrams I ever made, not in my life, for the business. I was basically like, I feel like there's 4 main parts to this. And as an individual, you can sort of go into a tangent of any one of these and go back around the system. But as an individual, some of you might go into education, find out about this, as I did. Like philosophy, I found out that that animals do have a voice. We just don't understand it yet to the capacity that we should do, but we should be listening to them. It's very evident what animals are saying in the slaughterhouse. It's not, yay, it's not that. So I went into university over COVID, got a degree in philosophy. I had training in eco-activism. I understood what that meant from a climatological perspective, and I said to myself, well, I'm going to, with my sales and business development experience, try and sell the idea of being more moral towards the environment. Tick. Businesses love that. They'll chuck money at it, which is fantastic because we need organizations to understand stuff. But that provided me with the overview of training, which led me into activism, which is where I am today. The action leads me to different charities, more established long-term organizations that say, hey, we're doing this and here's why. Charities usually have a lot of experience behind them. I mean, shock horror, 30 years of experience working in the sector, you get to know the things pretty well, which then can help inform businesses. Take, for example, VFC, wasn't around 5 years ago, 6 years ago, and all of a sudden it's now a major supermarkets and it's a vegan-led company by a guy who did a main panel talk here. Amazing stuff. We're seeing movement that has probably been informed by what's going on by direct action charities. That gives businesses the experience, and businesses then get involved in educating everyone else. And so the cycle goes round and round and round. And I think that's a wonderful thing for a joined up movement. You don't have to just go into animal oppression. You can jump into loads of different other kinds of oppression to figure out, well, where's the commonality of oppression? How can we share ideas to help make our own communities of practice resilient? How can we change the lives of others in wildly different life scenarios and wildly different oppression scenarios to our own? Like, I was pretty firmly made aware of my privilege as a white man from a middle-class background by reading critical race scholars that said and talked to the oppression of racial injustice and how white men basically subjugated them throughout their lives. I was made aware of my privilege as a white man by feminist scholars. I was made aware of my privilege through animal oppression by going, God, I'm not being slaughtered. What a great thing. Like, I'm only coming at this from the perspective of I want to share ideas with you that I have come across in the movements, but we're all going to have our own kinds of oppression. And I think that's the biggest thing for me, is understanding how we can overcome points of oppression through a multidimensional lens. And it is in the Anthropocene that we need that kind of tactical orientation to say, look, there is something bigger than us going on here. We have a climate crisis. We have a really, really small window in order to operate a really conclusive end to all of this oppression. Otherwise, it's not looking great. And I'm just out there going, well, how can I help? What can I do? How can I help you with the privilege that I have as a white man, being able to stand in front of an audience like this and other audiences in front of businesses, because I'm a friendly face to a lot of people who maybe don't realize that they're oppressing others, and go, well, what can I do? How can I help the movements? How can I get involved in feminist works? How can I get involved in critical race works? How can I get involved in animal oppression and overcome the system that has unfortunately oppressed lots of people, and we don't really know what we're doing? There are works out there. Go and read. Go and read from other different kind of oppressive styles. Read in the critical race tradition. Read in the feminist tradition. Read in the queer and disabled traditions to understand what kind of oppressions they face and see, actually, yeah, I can help that in this way. You can still be involved in animal activism, and we do need to have a cohesive effort, but we don't need to silo ourselves so effectively that we forget and just put blinkers on us. We forget other movements exist, or we discredit why they're happening when we think we've got a bigger problem over here. We've all got big problems. But that's sort of what I'm trying to do as a business. But there was a lot in there, and thank you for listening. But yeah, guys, if you have any questions, please let me know, and appreciate that.
Oh yes, I'm going to open the floor now to questions. Put your hand up, I'll bring the mic over to you. You're quite close, you probably don't need it, but so everybody else can hear.
Thank you. Really enjoyed that talk. I have a philosophy background too, and I'm writing an essay on changing the Anthropocene. So this was really helpful. Great literature recommendations, so thanks. No a general one to add as well. Charles Mills on liberalism is also a great multidisciplinary approach to this. So what I wanted to ask is this topic, I think is becoming a little bit more mainstream in terms of expanding the moral circle, but specifically with regards to digital sentience. And I wanted to ask if you think that this is a help or a hindrance in terms of the ambition of getting other people to consider animals within the moral circle. Does that disrupt the effort that we're trying to achieve, or might it help?
Do you mean like digital sentience as in like AI sort of
sentience?
Yeah. Oh, that's a good question. I've sort of kept AI at an arm's reach purely because the way that we're going means probably won't have an internet in 10 years as we know it. The idea that we can prop up the amount of power and energy needed to get AI to the point of sentience, a lot. I would say, yes, it helps people inform it, but unfortunately our ego is so big as the human race, we go, we have created sentience. And I'm like, there's sentience there. You're already, you're eating sentience for breakfast, for goodness sake. I think, yes, it will help in the sense that if you believe that there is another form of sentience out there, that will help. I think for me, I would automatically push people to the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness. I would push them towards written literature, Mark Bekoff's Other Animals. There are so many pieces of literature out there already which speak to the existence of sentience and consciousness and rationality in other beings, that it feels a little bit reductive to say, I think AI is going to help inform us. It may do, and I think AI does have a place in maybe elucidating the ideas of sentience and what sentience is, if not a human consciousness. But perhaps from the perspective that if we do create a sentient AI, what would be our first instinct to do to that AI? Is it to put it to work constantly, day after day after day after day? Is it to oppress it in a way that we have oppressed other minorities? Is it to basically put it automatically into a place of subjugation rather than being an equal and a peer among us? I think that's a much bigger question, because obviously you can't pull the plug on an organic thing to say, oh, it got a bit too smart, click. Whereas, with an animal, you're ignoring its sentience and you're bolt gunning it in the head usually. I think, yeah, good question, but I really wouldn't have a direct answer to that. I'm so sorry.
Thank you.
No worries.
Any more questions?
Yeah. It's very quiet in here, isn't it?
Hiya, Stuart. I'm Melda. Sorry, I was late. I missed the first bit, but I saw that it was on critical animal studies, and critical animal studies is the main theoretical lens in my PhD. I'm here with my supervisor, Matthew. We're from the Open University.
Oh, cool.
So my question is, how would you look into collaborating with academics and PhD students with your project?
Oh, well, I'm actually looking to do a PhD as well in critical animal studies, and you'll be surprised how difficult it is. And I was pleased to see about the vegan thesis being launched, because that will help in a great way to organize research. But yeah, so I think it's sort of, I'm a bit of a nerd, and I like to read, and I like to really get down into the theory and the practice of how all of this works. I think PhDs have a wonderful way of kind of like drilling down into a thing. And I think critical animal studies have a really good way of going, look, here's a bunch of literature, go and see what oppression is out there in the world. Depending on what the PhD's on, I do believe there is this battle between academics who really want to research, the 17th leg of a millipede to the nth degree of detail, which I believe is useful in some capacity. And I think education and research for research's sake should still be funded and should still actually be out there. But in the context of the Anthropocene and the climate crisis, we're kind of running out of time. And I feel like there should be some more pressing things that we should be focusing on. So critical animal studies really helps to narrow and focus that lens on things that we should be considering about, whether that be oppression, whether that be different forms of animal exploitation, yada yada. So I think there's a real place in a project like this to help businesses and activism groups and charities to understand their models, or you can take it from a sociological lens, you can take it from an anthropological lens, you can take it from a business studies lens. You could do loads of different things with a PhD that would help projects, for example, in the Animal Alliance Project or in the Environmental Alliance Project, to understand where they are in the movement, what they're doing, how they could improve, what their strengths and weaknesses are, what theoretical models they're working through. Can you get their research that they're producing on the ground, like the direct activism, more well known? Like, for example, let's take some of the direct action stuff. You could potentially do a PhD on the effects of direct action in the Southeast, and do a real good PhD on why animal activism in the Southeast is so important. That is a way that means that research can really help inform a movement. But again, it depends on how you want to fund your PhD, how you want to spend your 3 years doing that PhD. And I think for a lot of people, I myself still can't narrow down what I want to do for a PhD. I'm like, oh yeah, critical theory and Lukács and all this stuff, yeah, brilliant. And I'm going, it's 3 years of my life that I'm probably not going to focus on the animal rights movement as much as I should do, because I've got this sort of theoretical underpinning of critical theory that most of you probably would never have heard of and wouldn't be interested in, wouldn't read. I think the impact of a PhD should be, at the end, it can be released and can be published and can have abstracts made of it that inform a movement insofar as it changes the directory or helps inform it or solidifies it or confirms it in some way. And again, not to detract from research for research's sake, and because I do love education, I love reading. The academics out there might love it and go, yeah, this is great. But for the animal rights movement, the people on the ground saving chickens, what's that going to do for them? If it's something that doesn't speak to them and they can't relate to and can't actually take action upon, doesn't really make much difference. And that does sound a bit pessimistic toward PhDs, and I don't want it to sound like that, because they can have a great gearing for good in the world. But the impact they can make, I think, needs to be targeted. It needs to be applicable change in a way that actually speaks to the animal rights movement in the context of AAP, or the environmental rights movement in the context of EAP. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
No worries.
Thank you. Any further questions? Yeah.
Hi, I really enjoyed the talk. I found it really interesting. I study anthropology. I'm in my second year undergraduate, and I don't really think I've come across critical animal theory before. So I'm just interested, where can I find critical animal theory? Are there journals about it? Yeah.
Yeah, there are. Let me just skip back through the slides for a quick second, because if you go on to, where are we? If you go on to European Association for Critical Animal Studies or the Institute for Critical Animal Studies, there is the Journal for Critical Animal Studies, JCAS. And that's got loads of open source material that speaks to critical animal studies. But you can find it in JSTOR. If you type in critical animal theory or anything like that, you can start to see the literature come through as a keyword term as well. It sometimes comes under critical anthropology, sometimes comes under critical anthrozoology. So there's lots of different ways and means to get into that vein of research by typing in keyword terms. A lot of the times, some people may not specifically say critical animal studies because their research grant prevents them from sort of going down too many political avenues. But you can find it through keywords of animal oppression, and you can find authors in that space that are working in that sort of style of critical animal theory.
Thank you.
No worries.
Anybody else at the back there, coming down the middle for you?
Cameron, PhD student. So, I just wanted to ask a little bit about, obviously, so in my research, I speak to activists quite a bit. And one of the things that comes up is people saying, human issues are kind of a distraction and creating conflict in the movement is taken away from animals. So I just wondered what role your business kind of plays in some addressing some of those concerns do people have, and whether that's something you kind of think about in your role.
When you say humans are detracting from the movement, do you mean human-related issues like social justice
Yeah,
movements?
human issues. I mean, as in like when people try and bring in something like what you talked about, intersectional issues. Obviously some animal activists sort of say that there's a sense of that they feel that is detracting from their core goal of focusing on the animals and creating sort of conflict within the movement as people disagree on these issues.
I absolutely get that, and I think this is where the multi-dimensional element comes in. Is that we are now nearly 8 billion people on this planet. If 1% of us put our minds to any one social justice movement and really went for it, I think we'd make a lot more change. The unfortunate thing is people are either scared, they are living in a subsistence mindset where they're just trying to get through day to day. And I feel like if you're focusing on animal oppression and all of a sudden, sexism is being in the news and they're like, but the plight of animals. It's like, well, yeah, the plight of animals, but let's look at the sort of cross-sectional theory done by people like Laurie Gruen in sort of like ecofeminism, for example, and we speak to the ideas of the idea of sexism in the meat and dairy industry, where female bodies are more abjectly exploited than male bodies. Male bodies are usually shot from birth or near there because they're just not of any use. So you can start to see that the correlation, if we start to dismantle sexism and the ideas of patriarchal subjugation, then actually people might look at the animal oppression and go, well, dairy cows are female. They should be being taken care of because we've established that feminism is a thing. We've established that we should be treating female bodies with more respect and autonomy than we are. So I think actually taking away from or trying to draw away the focus from other social justice issues is only detracting from our own movement and our own pace that we can go at. And this is why I sort of speak to joined up thinking, and I'm saying, guys, we're all sharing a commonality of oppression via a one central house that's kind of dishing out all this stuff. What we should do is all go in and say, well, where's the commonality of oppression? If it's racialization, animalization, if it's the subjugation of female bodies, both in human and non-human animals, we can talk to these issues and have a civilized debate on how we can actually overcome the overarching issues of racialization, animalization, sexism, gender, class, blah, 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 without having to essentially fight for space. And yes, the media is a big vehicle in what is prominent in the news and what is going to reach more social awareness, but I don't think it's going to be full anytime soon. I feel like if we are pushing multiple things to the fore, there is more reason to say that yes, we can get more movements going at a quicker pace than if we were all trying to fight for this one, headline news space.